Sherry is working tonight, so she will not be joining us live. So, and crank some stuff out before the end of the year. The kids here are already out, I guess, huh? So today was the last day, and is everybody already out? Okay. Okay, Genesis chapter 47. We're going to hopefully finish it up tonight. Verses 27 through 31. Now, Israel lived in the land of Egypt in Goshen, and they acquired property in it and were fruitful and became very numerous. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. When the time for Israel to die drew near, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "Please, if I have found favor in your sight, place now your hand under my thigh and deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but when I lie down with my fathers, you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place." And he said, "I will do as you have said." He said, "Swear to me." So he swore to him. Then Israel bowed in worship at the head of the bed. Okay, so we see, among other things, the dream that Joseph has that even his parents will worship him is fulfilled in this passage. Of course, his mother is already sleeping with her fathers and mothers, and now Jacob is anticipating his own passing. Any other thoughts on this last several verses of the chapter?
He didn't want to be buried in Egypt.
Don't bury me on the lone prairie, something like that. Where do you want to be buried? Anybody got any preferences?
I got a little grave right in the backyard.
Okay. So you want to be back there with them? Is that?
Back there with all the dogs.
Okay.
Well, I will be with my son.
If Dixie would have still had their cemetery open, we somehow got Dad buried in there.
Buried in Dixie, huh?
Yeah,
Where is that?
in Dixie.
Do you have relatives there?
Just bury an Alabama boy in Dixie, I think is the.
Oh, there it is.
There's not much cotton up there. I think old times have been forgotten. Well, what do you think the significance of wanting to be buried in Egypt is for Jacob?
Not wanting to be buried.
Yes, not wanting to be buried in Egypt.
Because he was promised the land of Israel, I assume, and that's where he wanted to be buried. And of course, he also wanted to be buried in the same tomb that his father and grandfather, and so on and so forth, which I'm sure had great significance to him from that standpoint too. But also, most importantly, because that was the land that God had promised, not only he, but his father and grandfather.
Egypt is a waiting room.
Right.
It is not the destination.
Final destination.
And it is a long-term waiting room. It's like when you go to the airport, do you want short-term parking or long-term parking? Well, you Walla Walla folks don't have to worry about it. It's all free, no matter where you park out there, I guess. But you go to Seattle or even I think Tri-Cities, they have the parking divvied up a little bit, and then the closer you get to the airport, the more you pay. So this is long-term parking. But parking it is, and
because of their culture, where they were buried had a meaning that really today, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but where they're buried to me doesn't mean anything in the sense that it meant to him. Maybe to me, personally, it might mean like my dad was cremated, it remains up on the mountain. Finding things is, but other people, if they want to be buried with their parents, whatever. So it's our personal religious or a cultural thing?
Well, I think in this case it does have a lot of religious significance. It has, to have Jacob buried in Egypt is to have Israel buried in Egypt. So Israel will be buried in the promised land. And they will be reunited with him, and he goes kind of to prepare, in a sense, you could say, prepare a place for them, that where he is, they will be also. Sadly, you'll be buried up there too one day, but you couldn't do that for everybody that was in the family, and you couldn't do it really according to Mosaic law, which required burial within basically as quickly as you could do it, and certainly ideally within the same day. So if you died in the morning, you were buried that afternoon. So
Because the land falls, because of things related to the land, when they came out of Egypt. I mean, we're aware where they put rock stones to mark certain spots, certain wells. So there was a lot of significance in the land and things on the land. We just don't have to do.
Well, I don't know about that, Robert. I think we do tend to place a lot of significance on the land.
In our religion?
I would say in our national kind of civil religion,
Okay.
in our idea that to some extent, historically, I think Americans have seen themselves as kind of a new chosen people and acted accordingly at times, sadly.
Well, and also, God can't take care of it, so we gotta go over there and defend Israel and keep Israel proper and safe in Jerusalem for God's coming back. We gotta protect them people, so, yeah, there's a lot of religious and like, to some degree political, but still going on nowadays, but.
Yes, that's the difference I was trying to say is you read the Old Testament and you understand the Jews were God's people. Because of that, there were certain things that they did right wrong. They did it that way. Whereas today, as a Christian, this body is going back to the earth. It has no, to me, I don't have a significance that I need to be buried at this spot. Here is really apparent that was something. There was a very strong significance to the land. But I don't see that today. Is what I think.
Well, I think
in Jerusalem,
if you're trying to follow the law or the path of Christ, and you come to the conclusion that, again, like you said, this is dust. We're made of dust, and the dust will return, and which I think is one of the most comforting thoughts in the Bible. That this is really, none of this is that big a deal. You're dust, and to dust you'll return. So
yeah, to me, that's a comfort. I don't think I'd be a Christian now, today, except I read that, I believe it. I believe God will fulfill his promise that there will be a place, there is a place in heaven that is so wonderful I can't even imagine what it is. And that to me is very comforting.
But you were, I think, making this point, which was that all of these things, the wells and the graves and all that, were landmarks, and they help Israel. And we'll see it a little bit more here in the next chapter, but they help solidify, at least in Israel's mind, their claim to the land. Because when they come up out of Egypt, there's already people living on that land and have ancient historic claims to that land. And Israel, I guess the nicest way to say it is, dispossesses the people of that land. And Israel presents it as everything else. It comes from God. God told us to do that, so it's authorized, but God wants us. And when people get driven out before them, that's God doing that on their behalf. And that's their comprehension and their presentation. This is Israel's story, basically.
And they didn't do it right. And they destroyed certain places, and they took some of the people and so forth. They got in trouble from that too. So
They did, but then God also says, now they will stay. Now I'm not going to drive them entirely before you. They will remain in the land.
But
So-
they got stopped pretty good sometimes because they didn't follow
Mhm.
what God said. Sometimes that was take over land. And then how many people they needed. So we take this many people and you can do it. So again, putting your trust in God, even back then, today it's the same thing. I put my trust in God. If he'll do what he says he's gonna do. And sometimes that's.
It's that they are still the family of faith, even with this approach to the land. I mean, the original covenant given to Abraham is, I will make of you a great nation. And a great nation in their mind, and I still think in most people's mind, is a nation that has people and land. If you don't have a lot of people and you don't have any land, you're not much of a nation. So you're going to make of you a great nation, and that means the land.
There is in our country, there are religious ties to those things. And you go to Catholic cemeteries, old cemeteries, sectioned up, where there are Hispanic people that are buried in one place. There are like the little things that are built that are kind of within a family that have religious things. Our military, the Arlington Cemetery, and there's a lot of significance that has a meaning to where we might be buried too. Everybody may not feel that way, but it's historically there's been that in our country too.
And maybe some of us are able to delineate all of these different things going on in our minds between patriotism and family, emotional, and all that, and religious and spiritual, to make sharp lines between all that. Other people, it's a little blurry. And certainly for Israel, there were no lines. That's the thing. I mean, we like to think about separation of church and state and everything. And for Israel, there was no separation. The church was the state. The law was the law of God. Their religious law was their abiding law. So they do have a very intense relationship with their land. And one of the hallmarks of the land is that the three big patriarchs were buried there: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph is ultimately relocated there and everything too. But it's Joseph is not at the level in terms of patriarchy as those first three are. Joseph is, Jacob, in a way, as flawed as he is, in a way, you could say, the big patriarch. He's the one named Israel. He's the one that gives the people their name. And all of his sons are the tribes of Israel, whereas Isaac has Esau. Abraham has Ishmael and other kids and all that. So it's, and Jacob is hard to put your arms around to a large extent, and we'll maybe talk a little bit about that. But he is the last of the true, I think, patriarchs. These other guys are the heads of the tribes. And Joseph doesn't even, in a sense, get his own tribe. He gets two tribes, but they don't bear neither one bears his name. So, and yet he's one of the 12. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. But it is important that from a religious standpoint, and there was no difference really for them at the time, for Israel, for Jacob, for Israel to be buried in the promised land where they trust God to lead them back to and deliver them to. So, we have this kind of elaborate ceremony that's put your hand under the thigh. We've seen that before. It seems a little awkward to me. I would say, just take my word for it. I'm not touching your thigh, but that's how I handle things. But that's, even with my dad, I'd probably say, Dad, I'll do it. Okay. You don't have to. But, so we have, in this sense also, though Joseph is greater. He has the power. He has saved the family. He is the leader of Egypt. And yet he is binding himself to Israel, to his father. So, anyway, let's wrap that up. We spent now large more than I wanted to in chapter 47. I didn't know if we were ever going to get out of chapter 47. So let's move into chapter 48. See if we have any comments here. We have Thelma and Robin here and Kim here. I hope all you ladies are doing wonderfully this evening. We're glad Kim is on the rebound. And some challenging news today, but hopefully it will stay better than it could have been. So Genesis chapter 48 is, I think, a very presents a very sharp difference between how some cultures handle death and how America handles death. And I realize our cultural response to death is shaped to a large extent by the fact that historically a large percentage of our population has identified as Christians. So they see death somewhat through the lens of the cross, through the lens of the open grave, through the hope of the bodily resurrection, the reuniting with God for all eternity. And that is certainly the hope that we have. That is what God has promised us. And just as Israel is hoping on returning to the land of Canaan, we hope and we trust in the promises of God. At the same time, I have been astounded sometimes by the response of people to the death of a loved one and what they do either or in remembrance of that person or what they don't do in the remembrance of that person. And maybe we should have Carrie Lees here tonight talking about this to some extent. But so many people today, when they die, there is absolutely no remembrance of them at all. The families move on. And I personally can kind of understand that. If I died tomorrow, it'd be fine with me if I just moved on, moveon.org, but I'd like to share you maybe one tear, maybe, but that's but so I can kind of understand. I'm not exempt. When I criticize America, American culture or whatever, most of the time I'm not exempt. I'm kind of criticizing myself as well. I don't know that it's a healthy sign, though. I think, historically, the death of a loved one, if it went unnoticed, it was a sign that they were unloved. If they went unremembered, it's a sign they were unloved. And that's one of the reasons the ladies were coming back to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus on the Sunday after his crucifixion, because it was a tomb that would be used by other people. And we don't have that in our culture too often. We do have like the mausoleums or whatever where they put the cremains in sometimes. And sometimes I guess they put whole caskets in those things and in a vault and seal them up above ground, and they're all next to each other. So it's a common area, not just one person buried there. But they would come in and Jewish people didn't embalm. I mean, they didn't do that. You just got buried, all natural, wrapped up in your shroud and all that other stuff. But if someone had gone into the tomb of Jesus and had seen that his body was not anointed with spices and it was not honored that way, it would have sent a message to those people that this man was unloved, that nobody cared about him. I mean, at the same time, other people, since they're going in there during the decomposition process, it kind of hopefully helped, with the ventilation aspect. Hopefully with the, it didn't quite smell as bad. I don't know about that. If you've ever smelled somebody with cologne that hadn't taken a shower in a couple of days, the cologne really doesn't help. They're trying, and that's kind of the symbol that this person is loved. We don't want people thinking nobody loves this person. Nobody loved this person during his earthly life. So we're going to take care of his body after he's dead. And I think to some extent, our refusal to really process and acknowledge loss and grieve loss is a sign that we are not equipped to acknowledge and grieve loss. I talked to a man, I didn't end up doing it. I interviewed a funeral home director for one of my assignments in my graduate program, and she took my name and number, and I got a call from a young father whose 3-year-old son had died from cancer. He had been sick for 2 years. He'd been in the hospital nonstop for 2 years. So when he's 1 year old, he has cancer, and he goes in, checks in the hospital, stays there for the rest of his very short life. And they did not want to have a funeral. They wanted to have a celebration of life. And I just couldn't get my mind around that. What is there to celebrate? This, tragic event occurred. This is a life that just was not afforded to live, and what time it had was in the hands basically of strangers who probably did everything they could, but a lot of suffering and just one of those heartbreaking stories you hear about. This isn't some guy who stormed Omaha Beach on D-Day with just a knife in his hands, killed 20 Krauts, and lived to tell the tale, and died in his 90s or whatever, 100 years old, smoking a cigar every day and having a good time. This was a child, an infant, that never really got to live. And maybe they're just happier, more optimistic people than me, and they certainly exist. But can we not grieve? Are we incapable of acknowledging loss? Can we not lament? I mean, God's people have. Jesus lamented. Jesus wept when his friend died. Jesus lamented over the city of Jerusalem for a destruction that it had not yet endured. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. It is normal to grieve. It is normal to feel loss, to acknowledge loss, to love the one that's departed, and to feel like something's been taken from you because it has. Now, grief in America, again, is very personal, and we talk about that, and it is. But our whole lives are very personal, aren't they? Our whole lives are very insular. We all live our own little lives. And that's just not the experience of people in antiquity. I mean, you lived as a member of the community, as a member of your extended family. Everybody knew you. Everybody knew when your loved one passed away or whatever. And so when they come over to your house after someone has died, there's going to be mourners out there weeping and wailing and everything when they get there. And they're going to be professional, some of them. If a big, powerful, wealthy man dies, his family's going to hire a whole bunch of mourners to come there and just wail and weep and just... That way, when the family comes out and they are wailing and weeping, they're not wailing and weeping alone. When we're at a funeral and the widow starts crying or whatever, we may feel sorry for her or whatever, but, we don't join her in that weeping, do we? Sometimes we do.
Yes, we do.
We should. Well, maybe I'm just speaking for myself here. When I see it, I just want to sit back and kind of compose myself and allow the person to do whatever they need to do. But I don't have that relationship with the person who's most grieved by it. So I don't express it. And I think it's good if we do. It's brothers and sisters in Christ. But what if you go to a funeral where it's not someone who's a brother or sister? There's somebody, a coworker you knew, maybe not all that well, but you went to their funeral. Maybe.
The family start crying, I start crying.
Well, but you also, when it is these professional mourners, when Jesus shows up for the little girl who's died, and there's all these weeping and wailing people, and he says, she's not dead, she's just asleep, they can turn it off in a minute. They can start laughing. And we wonder, how can you go from that, from weep? Well, they're just doing it for $1. They've been paid to be there and mourn this little girl. So it's a more, and it's a healthier view of death. And as Jacob views his own imminent demise, he does so in the context of not himself going forward, but in a sense, his life continuing through his children, through the community that has sprung from him and his wives and their offspring. And so he looks at death not so much as just himself dying, or not, in a sense, nothing is dying. He's Israel. Israel isn't going away. Israel is prospering in the land of Goshen, and Israel will one day return to its promised land. So it's sad, it's bittersweet, but there is sweetness there. But there's also an acknowledgement of the bitterness. And we have, I think, a really hard time in America coping with loss. And if we can't cope with loss, I don't think we can cope with gain. And that's kind of my ultimate point of it all. If we can't be grieved, if we can't lament, if we can't express sorrow, then how can we authentically express joy? How can we authentically celebrate gain if we can't mourn loss? Yes, sir.
As you're saying it, just came on my mind. That's basically how I look at Jesus. When the Lord suffered, there's two emotions. One's happiness and one's sorrow. So he had to die for my sins. That to me, it was just, I can't even try to get my head around that. But the second part is, he rose from the dead. So I'm happy for that. I'm grateful for that. So it's, the two things almost go hand in hand. In my thinking, that Jesus, the Savior, the one that came to earth as a man and died as a man, but also the one that came to save me from his sins. Should I be downcast and sad about it, or should I be happy about it? Well, I'll give you an example. My wife hasn't heard this yet, but she will now. And her father was dying over here in the restaurant, and he was in pain, and we were praying for the relief of his pain. But in my mind, I was still thinking, yes, he's got all this pain, and now as I come under some of the same pain he had, meaning my back and legs, things that really hurt, that are painful. Yes, that's painful, but I don't have that same pain Jesus had. The sorrow he had for the whole humanity. So there is a difference there that if we can recognize, I think helps us, or helps me anyway, to realize that my existence and my pain that I have, yeah, for me, it's a personal thing, and it should be, and I should grieve when I lose my dad, when he died, my mom just recently. So there's a grief there, but there's also a happiness when Jesus died. So the two can get a little confusing.
Well, they can coexist too.
Right.
And they are mixed with other. I mean, it's amazing. That was the reaction of the disciples when they see Jesus resurrected, is not so much unmitigated or unqualified joy as it is amazement and disbelief. They can't, it's, stunned. I mean, we critique Thomas, doubting Thomas, but we didn't see what Thomas saw. If we had seen it,
we did walk in his shoes.
if you were a descendant of someone who got guillotined in the French Revolution, and you see Grandpa get his head chopped off, and then Grandpa walks through the door for dinner that night, you're going to be a little stunned by it. So the Romans were really good at killing people, and so when Jesus died on the cross, he was dead. He was good and dead. And to have him risen,
he suffered. time.
He suffered, man. You talk about your pain being different, and yet you can also find comfort in knowing that God knows what pain is.
Oh, yeah, he was.
And Jesus knew what sorrow was. Again, he wept for his friends. So it's
He was afraid to take it from him,
mhm.
but yet he still went through it.
So let's look at the first 7 verses, and we'll start looking at how Jacob faces his final fate here. Now it came about after these things that Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is sick." So he took his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. And when it was told to Jacob, "Behold, your son Joseph has come to you," Israel collected his strength and sat up in the bed. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And he said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession. Now your 2 sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. But your offspring that have been born after them shall be yours. They should be called by the names of their brothers in their inheritance. Now, as for me, when I came from Paddan, Rachel died to my sorrow in the land of Canaan on the journey, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem." So, what do we think about those passages there?
Well, if you're wondering about how the death of his wife affected him, you'll find out right here, because you read places where, on the way there, his wife died. And it doesn't really explain it really in detail. But you can see from this, the buried there.
To my sorrow, and it was the wife in whom he was well pleased.
Right. You see that, what you've been talking about, you see it here. It's very clear.
Hi, Nell. Nell's here too. So, and I know the connection has been a little shaky tonight, and I apologize for that. Yeah, this is the death of Rachel is a big deal, and he's talking to Rachel's firstborn son. So dad's calling in the son and saying, when your mom died, it really affected me. It's brought sorrow, and when you look back at the previous chapter 47, when he is speaking to Pharaoh. He's griping and whining. All my days have been miserable. I've had so much problems, so much sorrow, and I'm old, but I'm not going to be nearly as old as my parents and my dad and all that. And, it's been a miserable existence. I guess, I don't know if I'm authorized to tell this or not, but Jewish comedians, of which there are a lot, most of the old comedians especially were Jewish. They have a Gentile joke. And that Gentile joke, I think, is really funny, but you're supposed to only get it if you're Jewish. So maybe I'm not entitled to laugh at it. I don't know. But it's one Protestant businessman walks up to another Protestant businessman and says, "How's your business going?" And the other one says, "Fine, great." And that's it. That's the joke. Because if one Jewish man goes up to another Jewish man and says, "How's your business going?" it doesn't really matter how it's going. All the one Jewish man is going to talk about every challenge, everything he doesn't like, all the headaches, all the problems he's had. He's just going to unburden on him, and never ask him how he's doing or how his business is going. So, like I said, y'all didn't really think it was all that funny either, so maybe it's not funny to us. But I've seen Jewish comedians tell the joke and to other ones that hadn't heard it yet, and they just bust out laughing as soon as they hear it. It's kind of a cultural thing. So you ask Jacob how he's doing, he's going to tell you. And maybe you don't even really want to hear, but we see this summation really in a sense of Jacob's life. And it doesn't go into all the details. It doesn't go into all the stories. We think of Jacob, I don't know about you, but I think of Jacob as someone who kind of gets away with a lot, who cheated people, who tricked people, who even tricked his own father, who basically tricked his brother twice, and really is a shyster, just a really not all that admirable of a character. Even his own uncle, yeah, Laban's the same way. He may have got it from his uncle, but it's kind of a sad state of affairs that they're each trying to get the upper hand on the other dishonestly, somewhat dishonestly at least. And you kind of feel like Jacob is this guy who gets away with stuff. And you see at the end of his life, well, in a way, maybe he does, but in a way, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he pays for all those tricks. He gets a trick played on him, which takes his son away from him for a very long time. And if life is bittersweet, maybe the first part of Jacob's life is more sweet than bitter, but it seems like the last part of his life is more bitter than sweet. And he can express and identify with suffering, even though he's a wealthy, privileged man in a lot of ways. He knows suffering and to some extent maybe dwells in it. But losing his wife, losing years with his parents, losing years with his brother, losing years with his son in whom he is well pleased, which is Joseph. All of this has happened. So he has had a lot of sorrow in his life. And he's going to take into his primary family, his nuclear family, Ephraim and Manasseh. They are going to be his sons now. He adopts the sons of Joseph. They're mine now. Now, I don't know how you would feel about your father adopting your kids. I liked my granddad just fine. I didn't want to be his son. I was glad to be my dad's son rather than my granddad's son. But it doesn't, I guess, really matter too much because Jacob isn't going to be around too much longer. But for the sake of the inheritance, Ephraim and Manasseh will be treated as sons of Israel rather than grandsons, and the other children to Joseph will inherit through them. But this is done to some extent, at least, as in a desire to maintain this number of 12. There's 12 tribes, and those 12 tribes are the 12 sons of Jacob. But if you take out Joseph and put in his two sons, that makes 13, right? 12 minus 1 plus 2 equals 13. I know that's taking you back to 8th grade and you don't want to go back that far, but that's 13. But Levi, when they go into the land, Levi will not get a specific geographical range as an inheritance. There's no area. If you look at the maps that you can find very easily, you might even have in your own Bible, of the division of the land of Canaan and of the tribes of Israel, there is no section labeled Levi, because Levi was the tribe of the priests, and therefore were scattered throughout the land. They would get cities, Levitical cities. They could have crops and herds, flocks, or whatever. They still had other ways to. They were bivocational, I guess you could say. They do their religious duties and also do these other tasks as well, be farmers. And when you take away Levi, but you also take away Joseph and replace them with Ephraim and Manasseh, now you're back to 12. So there's no division of the land that says Joseph on it either. Before the monarchy, before David, who was from the tribe of Benjamin, comes along, before Saul, who was from the tribe of Benjamin, comes along, and before David, who was the tribe of Judah, comes along, the prominent tribes, the most powerful, politically significant tribes were Ephraim and Manasseh. So prior to the monarchy, they're kind of the big boys, as a tribe. So they are elevated. They are adopted sons, and they become preeminent sons, in a sense, for Israel. And this maintains 12. There's 12 original tribes, and then the inheritance is divided among 12 tribes, even though they don't all, the list of the names don't match up exactly. So 12, we're not really into numbers all that much. Sometimes we don't think of it, but ancient audiences were. And 12 is one of those numbers of completion. 7 days, God created the planet and rested on the seventh day. 10, there's 10 commandments. 12, there were 12 tribes. There's also 12 original apostles, right? And when they lose the first one, they replace him with one. They consider a few, but replace him with one. With Matthias in Acts chapter 1. So they thought like that was a big deal, to have 12 of them. Now it's confusing as you go through some of the New Testament writings. It looks like maybe some other people got elevated. Maybe when another apostle died, they elevated another one. Maybe they're just people like Barnabas were so associated with the apostles that they got lumped in with them as well. It's hard to tell. And of course, Paul has his own apostleship apart from them, but with them too. I mean, he works with them and, with their understanding and everything. So 12, not that important to us. I mean, maybe you go down and that's the number on your lottery ticket. I don't know when you buy one, but don't tell me about it, because then I'll have to tell everybody about it. I'll have to pray for so-and-so, my lottery ticket. So don't tell me that. But it's kind of like, don't make eye contact me when I'm at McDonald's. Don't tell me everything. So, but 12 is a big number, and 12 is maintained. So, let's see what else we have on that. We're way over already. Okay, we'll call it good. We'll pick up in verse 8 and try to get through the rest. It's not a really long chapter. Try to get through the rest of chapter 48 next week. Thank you for your attention and your comments, and we will